I used to work with a man who treated the office like a gladiator pit. He didn't just work hard. I mean, he seemed to take this genuine, almost spiritual pleasure in seeing colleagues weeded out during quarterly reviews.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. He'd lean back in his chair and his eyes would have this sort of predatory satisfaction. And he'd argue that the company was a living organism, that it needed to shed its dead weight to evolve.
So he saw it as a natural process.
Completely. To him, the stress, the burnout, all the cutthroat competition, they weren't problems to be solved. They were just, the natural order doing its job. He took this strange pride in being one of the strong who survived the jungle of the corporate world. But then came the merger.
Oh.
And the new management, well, they don't care about his history or his alpha mindset. They just saw a high salary that could be cut to optimize the balance sheet. The day he was handed his severance package, the cold, detached philosopher just vanished instantly. He was livid.
I can imagine.
He spent his final hour in the break room shouting about loyalty and basic human rights, calling the whole thing a cruel injustice by a soulless system. It was a jarring transformation. The man who spent years worshiping the law of the jungle was suddenly horrified to find himself at the bottom of the food chain. And that split-second shift from championing the survival of the fittest to demanding fairness the moment he became the one being purged, it's more than just personal hypocrisy. It's a window into a mindset that has permeated our society, our social media, our very language. We call it social Darwinism.
Right.
It's the idea that life is an endless, brutal competition where the weak deserve their fate and the strong owe them nothing. But why has this 19th century theory become the unofficial religion of the modern age? And why are those most likely to be crushed by it often its loudest defenders?
That is such a powerful observation, and it cuts directly to the core of what we need to unpack today. You've highlighted the central tension perfectly. The philosophy only works if you are the winner. So our deep dive today is dedicated to analyzing this. This enduring belief that human existence is defined solely by brutal, endless competition, where poverty and power are just reflections of biological destiny. We need to understand not just what this belief system is, but why, despite being, frankly, intellectually bankrupt, it remains so incredibly alluring to so many people.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Our mission here is to provide you, the listener, with a thorough kind of three-part understanding of this concept. First, we're going to dissect the specific pseudoscientific claims that underpin it. Who actually came up with this idea, and why is it so often misnamed?
That's a huge part of it. The name itself is a misdirection.
Right. Second, we'll examine the simple but critical philosophical law that completely dismantles its internal logic. We'll show you why it just can't stand up to rational scrutiny.
And
finally, we will trace its path from justifying Gilded Age tycoons and laissez-faire capitalism all the way to underwriting the foundations of Nazi ideology and state-sponsored genocide. It's a critical journey, really, from parlor philosophy to the most extreme cruelty in human history.
It's a dark road, but an essential one to understand.
So, social Darwinism. Let's start with a basic definition. We usually say it's a group of pseudoscientific theories that claim to apply biological concepts.
Like natural selection and survival of the fittest.
Exactly, and apply them to sociology, to economics, and to politics.
And that's the formal definition. But the core belief, I think, is profoundly moralistic, even though it's disguised as science. The idea is that the strong should thrive and the weak should diminish.
There's an ought in there.
A huge ought. The strong deserve to dominate, and the weak deserve to perish or be exploited. The problem, though, is that the ambiguity lies entirely in how proponents define strong and weak.
Right. Who gets to decide?
Precisely. And that's why, historically, the philosophy has been this sort of logical rubber band. It's been used to justify almost any political conclusion its adherents already wanted to reach.
And you mentioned the naming. It's a complete historical mess, isn't it? The term Darwinism itself was coined by Thomas Henry Huxley in 1861, but the specific phrase social Darwinism, that came later.
It first appeared in 1877, but it wasn't embraced by its followers. And this is a really crucial detail for anyone trying to trace the intellectual lineage.
Why is that?
Because the term was actually popularized much, much later in the United States in 1944 by the historian Richard Hofstadter. And he used it as a pejorative, as a weapon against the reactionary creeds of the past, especially in the context of confronting fascism.
So what you're saying is that it's almost always been a label applied by opponents to criticize a set of ideas.
Almost always. It's not a proud, self-identified philosophical school. It just doesn't have the coherence for that.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, No politician or tycoon wants to stand on a podium and declare, I am a ruthless proponent of biological destiny. They want to sound like they're just upholding a natural law.
Of course.
But let's talk about the real progenitors of this idea, because it wasn't Charles Darwin.
No, absolutely not. The figure who is primarily linked to the ideology is the English philosopher Herbert Spencer. And this is where we get into the critical nuance that makes this philosophy so muddy.
Okay.
Spencer's views on social evolution actually predated Darwin's 1859 publication of On the Origin of Species. His major work, Progress, Its Law and Cause, was published in 1857.
So the core intellectual framework was already set up before natural selection was even scientifically formalized. That explains why Spencer's theory often felt more like sociology than biology.
Precisely. Spencer was heavily influenced by pre-Darwinian ideas, specifically from the French naturalist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck.
Lamarckism, that's the idea that acquired characteristics can be inherited, right?
Exactly. So for Spencer, this meant that the industrious habits and moral character developed by the fittest economic actors could be passed on to their children, leading to societal progress.
Wait, hold on. If Spencer believed that habits could be inherited, that changes the whole premise, doesn't it? It means if a poor person works hard, their children might inherit that fitness.
It does.
That gives a slight, if still pretty grim, path for social mobility through generational self-improvement. It's not the same as the later, stricter genetic determinists.
It's a key distinction, but Spencer's application was still ruthlessly harsh. He was also deeply influenced by Auguste Comte's positivism, this belief that society progressed through fixed, predictable stages toward an enlightened scientific state.
So he saw society as an organism.
Just like a biological organism, evolving and increasing in complexity through this constant purifying struggle. And he coined the now famous phrase, survival of the fittest, which Darwin later adopted because it so perfectly summarized the outcome of natural selection.
And Spencer rigorously applied this idea to public policy, advocating for strict laissez-faire capitalism and strongly opposing any state aid for the poor.
Yes. For Spencer, any form of welfare or public safety net was just a dangerous interference with the natural evolutionary process. He saw the struggle of the working class as necessary. He saw those who struggled as simply unfit.
In charity?
Charity, in his view, was counter-evolutionary. It kept the weak alive, encouraged them to breed, and diluted the overall genetic and social quality of the population. It was an incredibly cold, anti-philanthropic stance based on a profound misunderstanding of both biological and social systems.
That's a very specific brand of pessimism,
Right.
And we have to mention the influence of Thomas Malthus here, because his work seems to have provided the intellectual groundwork for that pessimism even before Spencer.
Malthus's 1798. An essay on the principle of population was foundational reading for social Darwinists, absolutely. His central, brutal argument was that human population grows geometrically.
While food supply only grows arithmetically.
Right. And this guaranteed perpetual competition, scarcity, famine, and the eventual starvation and death of the weakest members of society. This narrative of inevitable brutal struggle provided the foundational myth that allowed Spencer and others to apply that jungle metaphor to human economies.
It made poverty feel unavoidable.
And therefore excusable.
And then we have Francis Galton, who was Darwin's own cousin. He took this concept of inherited fitness and formalized the terrifying next logical step, eugenics.
Galton dedicated his life to it. He argued that mental qualities, intelligence, genius, talent, were inherited just like physical traits. And his anxiety came from observing that social structures like welfare programs and asylums were allowing what he called inferior humans, the poor, the mentally ill, the criminal, to survive.
And crucially, to reproduce faster than the superior elements of society.
Exactly. So if the unfit are reproducing faster, society is literally devolving. That's the engine of fear that drove the eugenics movement.
So Galton's conclusion was that if society didn't actively manage human breeding through state intervention,
what he called positive eugenics, encouraging the fit to breed, and negative eugenics, preventing the unfit from breeding.
then society risked being overwhelmed by so-called inferior stock.
That was the driving paranoia.
But wait a minute. If Spencer argued for laissez-faire, for the government to do nothing, and Galton argued for eugenics, for the government to actively manage breeding, doesn't that just prove the internal inconsistency of social Darwinism?
It absolutely does. And that inconsistency is the most powerful intellectual criticism against the whole philosophy. Depending on what you define as fittest, is it the individual corporation, the racial group, the nation? Social Darwinism can logically lead to vastly different, even diametrically opposed political systems.
So you could use it to justify pure economic libertarianism.
Or state socialism, or, as we'll see, extreme totalitarian eugenics. It's an ideological framework that really only works by being self-contradictory.
It sounds less like a genuine philosophy and more like a toolkit for pre-existing prejudices.
I think that's exactly what it is. It's an intellectual cloak that elites throw over whatever policies happen to benefit them at the time, whether that's deregulation or forced sterilization.
Its enduring utility is that it's intellectually bankrupt.
It fails to lead to any clear, consistent political conclusion, but it survives because it grants the powerful the ultimate moral comfort. The belief that their dominance is not just earned, but biologically and cosmically ordained.
Okay, let's talk about the philosophical flaw that really just renders social Darwinism incoherent. It's an error so fundamental it has this dramatic name, Hume's guillotine. And this error lies in the deeply ingrained belief that by simply observing the world and stating what is, we can somehow know definitively how we ought to live.
This concept is so essential for critical thinking. It was articulated by the Scottish philosopher David Hume in his 1739 A Treatise of Human Nature. And Hume identified what he called the is-ought problem.
The is-ought problem.
Now, the problem is structural. How can you logically derive a prescriptive statement, what we ought to do, an ethical guideline, from a purely descriptive statement, what is a factual observation?
Okay, so if I observe that a child is hungry, that's an is, how does that observation logically lead me to the conclusion that I ought to feed them? I mean, it seems obvious, but what Hume is saying is that the logical chain is broken without a connecting moral premise.
Precisely. The observation the child is hungry is a factual statement. The conclusion, I ought to feed the child, is a moral or prescriptive statement. The logical jump between them requires a hidden premise, something like, we are to relieve human suffering, or it is good to preserve life.
Without that hidden moral premise, the jump is logically invalid.
It is. This distinction is famously known as Hume's law, or Hume's guillotine, because it cleanly separates the realm of facts from the realm of values. Facts can't, by themselves, mandate morality.
So if I observe that the sun rises every morning, that is a fact. It tells me nothing about whether I ought to be kind to my neighbor.
And social Darwinism just leaps headfirst, without a parachute, right into this chasm. It commits what's called the naturalistic fallacy, a specific type of category error. The fallacy occurs when one observes a natural process like competition and suffering and the biological world, the is, and then asserts that this process should therefore be the moral guide for human society, the ought.
So observing that animals kill each other is an is, concluding that because nature is cruel, human society ought to be cruel. That's the fallacy.
Correct. When philosophers criticize social Darwinism, they are essentially saying, you have mistaken a description of nature for a blueprint for human behavior. We have to actively choose our morality. I mean, if we derived our ethics solely from the observable natural world, we would embrace disease, starvation, infanticide, brute force dominance.
Right.
Civilization, by its very definition, is the collective decision to build systems that actively counteract the harsher elements of the jungle.
This helps us understand the psychological damage done by the ideology. Let's go back to the story of Arthur, the dock worker, because he really internalized this fallacy. So imagine Arthur working these 16-hour days in the soot-choked ports of 19th century East London. His hands are permanently scarred, his lungs are black, and his family is confined to a single damp room. One freezing night, he stumbles into a lecture hall near the docks. A famous scholar, wearing pristine, tailored wool, is speaking about social evolution.
Okay.
The scholar, waving his hands dramatically, argues that Arthur's poverty wasn't the fault of greedy factory owners or bad policies, but was simply a matter of natural law. He paints this vivid picture of the economy as a great forest where the weak saplings, the unfit, must wither so the strong oak trees, the capitalists, can thrive.
And Arthur hears this.
Arthur, exhausted and demoralized, hears this and feels a perverse sense of relief. He thinks, my struggle is not a failure of character, it is an inevitability of biology. So he stops fighting for better wages because he's convinced his lot is as fixed and unchangeable as the force of gravity. He looks at his starvation not as injustice, but as destiny.
And the profound tragedy in Arthur's life is that he accepted a category error. He mistook policy for physics.
That's a great way to put it.
Laws of biology describe competition for limited resources among species. But the laws of human society are built on constructed systems, contracts, policy, morality, justice. The entire structure of civilization is a moral declaration that we choose not to live by the brutal law of the jungle.
So when he internalizes that, he's essentially telling himself that the robber baron who pays him pennies is biologically superior, and his own suffering is a sign of his inherent genetic inferiority.
That is the ultimate function of social Darwinism when it's deployed socially. When its proponents present human suffering or extreme inequality as some inevitable natural law, they are engaging in a sophisticated form of rationalization. They're not making a scientific observation. They are justifying a deliberate lack of policy choices, a conscious decision not to regulate, not to redistribute, not to provide a safety net.
Right.
If the system is unfair, social Darwinism neatly shifts the blame from the system builder to the victim's supposed biological failing. It just removes the need for empathy or moral intervention entirely.
The philosophical underpinnings are shaky, to say the least, but the application was devastating, especially in the economic sphere. Let's move to the American Gilded Age, because that's where social Darwinism truly became the unofficial creed of the elite.
The late 19th and early 20th centuries in the U.S. were just defined by this explosive industrial boom and a staggering concentration of wealth. You saw the rise of massive monopolies, railroads, oil, steel, and social Darwinism offered the perfect, high-minded moral shield for what was often just ruthless and destructive business practice.
And you see this articulated so clearly by the titans themselves. John D. Rockefeller, for example, claimed that the growth of his massive business empire was merely a survival of the fittest, the working out of a law of nature and a law of God.
That quote just encapsulates the fallacy. The factual observation of his own dominance is immediately dressed up as moral and divine destiny.
And no figure was more influential in codifying this for American elites than the Yale sociologist William Graham Sumner. Sumner was. He was uncompromising.
Uncompromising is the word. He argued that societal progress depended on a few fittest families concentrating and passing down wealth, which he believed carried superior genetic and moral traits.
And Sumner's work, especially his pamphlet, What Social Classes Owe to Each Other, is notorious.
It is. It was published in 1883, and his answer to the title question was a resounding nothing.
Nothing.
Nothing. Sumner was an absolute purist. He saw taxes, regulations, and public aid as catastrophic intrusions. In his view, the state was simply transferring resources from the productive fittest to the unproductive unfit.
I recall Sumner's argument was that aid to the poor encouraged the weak and inferior to breed.
Yes, his great fear was the dilution of the nation's genetic and moral fiber. He believed that the American businessman was the highest expression of evolution, perfectly equipped to win the struggle for existence. So therefore, any impediment to the businessman's success, be it a tax, a minimum wage, or regulation, was an impediment to natural progress.
He explicitly advocated for a society where the inherent characteristics of the successful few were the sole determinant of economic and social survival.
He did. But this sets up a fascinating tension within the Gilded Age elite itself. Because while Sumner was the intellectual champion of anti-philanthropy, you had figures like Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate, who were leading philanthropists.
Right, he gave away massive fortunes. And Carnegie, by the way, greatly admired Spencer.
That tension is crucial. Carnegie essentially practiced a kind of philanthropic social Darwinism. He codified it in his famous essay, The Gospel of Wealth. Carnegie accepted the social Darwinist premise that fierce competition was necessary to select the most capable individuals to lead industry. That was the is.
But unlike Sumner,
Carnegie believed that those selected fittest had a moral ought. They had a responsibility to act as wise stewards of their wealth, spending it on public goods like libraries and universities, thereby elevating the unfit and providing them with the means to become more fit.
So Carnegie saw himself as the genetically fit executor of the wealth, but he rejected the idea that the strong owed the weak nothing. He rejected that most extreme antisocial interpretation of the creed.
Exactly. But notice what remains consistent. Both Sumner and Carnegie used the theory to justify their accumulation of vast, unchecked power. Whether they later gave it away or not, the underlying rationale was the same. Our wealth proves our fitness, and therefore our right to determine the structure of society.
To bring this abstract elite justification down to earth, let's consider the tycoon, Silas, a man who saw his ruthlessness as a kind of cosmic duty. So Silas was a railroad tycoon whose empire spanned half the continent. He lived in a house so immense it was often referred to simply as the marble box, filled with imported tapestries and gilded fixtures, and he was utterly convinced of his own biological superiority. Every year, when he addressed his shareholders, he would quote Herbert Spencer, often with theatrical flourish, declaring that the concentration of wealth in his hands was not simply good business, but the very evolution of the American soul. Silas looked at the thousands of laborers, immigrants, former slaves, struggling farmers, who worked 12 hours a day in terrible heat to lay his tracks.
He knew they were exploited.
Oh, he knew they were exploited, underpaid, and easily replaced. But he justified this by believing they were merely the biological substrate upon which his greatness was built. In his mind, his ruthless decisions, crushing competitors, busting unions, ignoring safety, they were not acts of greed. They were divine acts of progress, purging the weak elements from the American gene pool.
That mindset just perfectly illustrates how social Darwinism provided a powerful moral hall pass for relentless corporate behavior.
Oh.
By framing their vast accumulated wealth and the corresponding systemic poverty as an inevitable biological law, Silas and his contemporaries deflected responsibility.
They shifted the blame.
They shifted the blame for poverty and systemic inequality, which were clearly the results of human choices about policy and exploitation, onto the supposedly immutable, inferior nature of the poor themselves.
It fundamentally reframes systemic injustice as personal failure. If the working class is suffering, it's not because the minimum wage is too low or conditions are unsafe. It's because they are biologically unfit to compete.
It makes inequality feel like a law of physics that must simply be endured. And it ensures that the dominant class never has to address the structural or systemic issues inherent in the economy. They are merely observing, not causing, the suffering.
This narrative held tremendous sway in elite northern universities, often funded by these very capitalists. But it was around this time that an essential counter-narrative emerged.
One rooted outside the dominant academic structure.
Yes. We have to discuss the work of W.E.B. Du Bois, who offered an insurgent critique designed to function as a liberating weapon.
Du Bois developed what is often called emancipatory scientific sociology, and it was founded on premises derived from the perspective of the oppressed, the African-American community navigating the horrors of Jim Crow and post-slavery exploitation.
And that perspective allowed him to see the social world in a way the dominant, often blindered academic structure could not. So what was that dominant view, what Du Bois later critiqued as white sociology?
The term white sociology in this context refers to the prevailing academic paradigm of the time. This paradigm, built largely within white northern institutions, maintained that systems of human domination, race, class, empire arose through natural or even cosmic forces. It explicitly or implicitly postulated that people of color were biologically and culturally inferior, which made white supremacy feel natural and inevitable.
So the white sociology paradigm accepted the social Darwinist premise that inequality was driven by biological difference.
Exactly. And Du Bois fundamentally challenged this. He argued that modernity itself, the entire framework of Western capitalism and power, was a product of constructed systems like the African slave trade and colonialism. These systems were built by powerful elites for the deliberate purpose of exploitation.
So his core argument was that the systems causing oppression were not natural necessities, they were human choices.
Yes, designed to enable Western elites to build empires through exploitable labor and resource extraction.
And he didn't just reject the economic justification, he explicitly rejected the biological component that social Darwinism relied upon.
Absolutely. Du Bois stated that the idea that difference, physical, spiritual, between classes or races argued for weakness or inferiority was sheer rot. He championed the position that African Americans were equals to all races and that their oppression was caused by social and economic construction, not by inherent biological traits or unfitness.
This makes his work a definitive refutation. If social Darwinism says inequality is a necessary biological outcome, Du Bois's work is the scientific and historical evidence that inequality is a choice constructed by humans.
And therefore capable of being dismantled by human agency. His work championed a bottom-up view. He focused his research on documenting the empowering agency of the oppressed, anchoring it in their own culture and institutions, like the Black church. He understood that sociological study shouldn't be aloof. It should function as a liberating weapon, using systematic, objective research to provide guidance for redressing oppression.
Which completely rejects the social Darwinist view that the oppressed are biologically destined for failure.
It does. And the form of social Darwinism we've discussed so far, the one that defined the Gilded Age, was fundamentally individualistic and economic, focused on corporate competition.
Right.
But historically, the ideology mutated into a far more destructive collective form. It became focused not on individual tycoons, but on race and national struggle. directed by the power of the state.
This is the critical shift from economic individualism to what's sometimes called Darwinian collectivism.
Yes, the concept of fittest migrated from the successful entrepreneur to the successful nation or the superior race. It fueled rampant global imperialism, justifying the exploitation of lesser breeds by superior races as a necessary and righteous struggle for global dominance.
And this collective focus immediately brings us back to the formal, institutionalized science of human breeding, eugenics.
Eugenics, established by Francis Galton, aimed to improve humanity through selective breeding. And this ideology was global. In the United States, it translated directly into policy. Sterilization laws were enacted in dozens of states targeting African Americans, immigrants, and the disabled.
And immigration restrictions.
Strict immigration restriction acts were passed specifically to prevent the influx of supposedly inferior European and Asian genetic stock. This wasn't fringe science, it was state-sanctioned policy.
But the ideology reached its most radical and terrifying expression when it was adopted by the Nazi Party in Germany and fused into a state program of racial hygiene.
Nazi ideology absorbed social Darwinism and eugenics into a doctrine rooted in uncompromising genetic determinism. This is a profound difference from Spencer's earlier, milder Lamarckian influences. Nazi ideology explicitly rejected the idea that environment or culture could influence heredity.
They insisted that heredity alone defined destiny.
Yes, and that human quality was defined purely by immutable biological traits passed down through generations.
This biological absolutism laid the groundwork for transforming pseudoscience into lethal law. And we have records that show Nazi officials were not secretive about where they found their inspiration.
That's a truly chilling aspect of this history. Nazi officials openly and diligently studied American precedents. They looked at Jim Crow segregation statutes, anti-miscegenation laws, and U.S. state sterilization programs as models. They saw these examples as proof that racial science could be successfully enforced by law within a modern industrialized Western nation.
So the U.S. system provided a functional model for the legal enforcement of racial hierarchy, which the Nazis then radicalized far beyond the American conception.
Far beyond. The American model, while brutal, maintained the fiction of separate but equal. The Nazis moved to an outright, non-negotiable rejection of any equality.
The Nuremberg Laws.
The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 were the legislative cornerstone. These laws redefined German nationhood based purely on race, stripping Jews of their citizenship, defining them as biologically alien and irredeemable subjects. The legal framework transitioned from a system of separation to one aimed at racial purification and eventually annihilation.
That escalation marks the radical character of Nazi racial ideology. It wasn't just about social dominance, it was a mandate for biological purity.
And this social Darwinist logic permeated their entire system of governance, not just race relations. Hitler, for example, often refused to set clear lines of authority among his officers or departments.
He encouraged them to fight amongst themselves.
Yes, to engage in pure internal competition, so that the stronger person or the fitter solution would inevitably prevail. The result was this chaotic system where success was defined not by virtue or principle, but by ruthless power struggles. This system of constant internal war was a direct, terrifying application of social Darwinism to the structure of the state.
And this logic extended beyond race to justify the elimination of those deemed unfit within the German population itself.
That's where the horror of involuntary euthanasia, known as Action T4, came from. It targeted the mentally ill, the disabled, the incurably sick. The rationale, rooted in social Darwinist principles, was that these individuals were a biological burden, a dead weight on the nation's progress, and therefore the weak and feeble should perish. Once you accept that human value is based on measurable fitness rather than inherent dignity, the path towards systematic elimination is terrifyingly short.
We can see the ultimate horror of this ideology laid bare in the records of how it was taught and normalized within institutions like the public school system. Imagine a classroom in 1930s Germany. This is the story of Greta, a schoolteacher who had previously taught classical literature but was now instructed to teach a mandated curriculum of racial biology. She stood before a class of 10-year-olds and was forced to draw charts on the chalkboard. And these charts ranked human beings like livestock, categorizing them into groups: life worthy of life and life unworthy of life.
Oh my God.
She had to lead lessons where students calculated the cost to the state of caring for a disabled child versus the cost of producing an Aryan citizen. The goal was to rationalize the elimination of the weak, Greta watched, sickened, as her students began to internalize this logic. They didn't see their mentally disabled neighbor, young Hans, as a boy. They saw him as a biological threat to the purity of the nation, a burden calculated in Reichsmarks.
It wasn't just theory.
This wasn't just detached classroom theory. This curriculum, rooted in social Darwinism and eugenics, became the foundation for the T4 program, which killed tens of thousands of disabled people and was the ideological precursor to the Holocaust. The message was simple and absolute. If progress is measured by eliminating burdens, then elimination becomes a societal mandate.
That anecdote shows the terrifying conclusion of social Darwinism. When the inherent dignity and intrinsic value of the individual are stripped away and replaced with a measure of biological fitness, the resulting system inevitably becomes a mandate for elimination. The idea that civilization is measured by how we treat our most vulnerable members is the essential moral distinction between a humane society and the pack operating under a perceived natural order.
And the global stage for this ideological conflict reached a dramatic climax in 1936 at the Berlin Olympics, which Hitler intended to be a showcase for Aryan supremacy.
It was a perfect setting for the ideology to be tested by reality. The Nazis used the games to promote their racial propaganda, but the entire fantasy was shattered by Jesse Owens, an African-American track star.
4 gold medals.
4 gold medals. Owens, through sheer undeniable achievement, delivered a stunning, direct, and irrefutable rebuke to the Nazi racial vision. His success proved that ability and achievement could not be confined or predicted by Nazi racial categories. The image of Owens on the podium became this symbolic moment where the elaborate structure of biological determinism just collapsed when confronted with tangible human reality.
But there's a deep, tragic irony in Owens' story that we can't overlook.
The irony is profound. While Owens embarrassed Hitler in Berlin, he returned home to a United States that was still rigidly constrained by Jim Crow. He still faced segregation, disenfranchisement, and a racial hierarchy, a system explicitly shaped by the very same pseudoscientific logic that the Nazis had simply taken to its most genocidal extremes.
So his story highlights that the intellectual roots of state-sanctioned racial control were shared across continents.
It demonstrates that the social Darwinist impulse was woven into the fabric of many Western nations' policies. Owens' defiance stands as a fundamental challenge to the entire social Darwinist project, both abroad and at home.
When we dissect the historical, philosophical, and human destruction wrought by social Darwinism, it's necessary to ask, did Charles Darwin, the scientist whose name was co-opted for this brutal social philosophy, actually believe in a cruel, individualistic jungle society?
That's such a crucial question, and the historical record is clear. Darwin's views were far more complex and humane than the ideology named after him. He understood that evolution encompasses more than just cutthroat individual competition. In The Descent of Man, Darwin argued that social instincts like sympathy and moral sentiments were themselves evolved traits, selected for through natural selection.
So empathy and morality weren't seen as soft impediments to fitness, but rather as powerful drivers of fitness for the species as a whole.
Absolutely. Darwin explicitly wrote that those communities, which included the greatest number of the most sympathetic members, would flourish best and rear the greatest number of offspring. For Darwin, the ability to cooperate, to sacrifice for the group, and to care for one another was itself an evolved advantage that strengthened society,
leading to greater success for the entire group.
Yes. Competition still existed, but it happened between groups, and the groups that fostered the highest internal cooperation were the fittest.
And this counter-argument was formalized by the anarchist philosopher and scientist Peter Kropotkin, who essentially weaponized Darwin against the social Darwinists.
Kropotkin's 1902 book, Mutual Aid, A Factor of Evolution, was a direct, forceful rebuttal to the social Darwinist interpretation popularized by Spencer. Kropotkin spent years observing animal societies and human communities in Siberia, and he argued that Darwin did not define the fittest simply as the strongest or the most clever, but recognized that the fittest were actually those who cooperated.
What were his specific observations that led to that conclusion?
Kropotkin noted that in many animal societies, especially those facing harsh environmental conditions, struggle is replaced by cooperation. He observed instances where species survive not through individual combat, but through mutual defense, shared resources, and collective care of the young and the sick. He argued that this mutual aid wasn't just an occasional occurrence, it was a major factor in evolution,
leading to the development of intellectual and moral faculties necessary for species survival.
Exactly. So Kropotkin's view is that the drive toward cooperation is actually the more scientifically rigorous reading of natural systems than the pure individual competition model championed by Spencer. He viewed the oppressive state as unnatural, precisely because it interfered with and prevented this natural mutual aid from fully manifesting in human social evolution.
So for him, the fittest are those who learn to combine and mutually support each other.
For the welfare of the community, yes. The struggle for existence is often best won not by fighting each other, but by uniting against external conditions, the environment, disease, natural disasters.
And if Kropotkin provided the argument for cooperation in nature, we should probably conclude by synthesizing how W.E.B. Du Bois provided the definitive argument for emancipation in society.
I think we have to. Du Bois' Black sociology postulated that oppression was caused by social construction, by human choices, and constructed systems of exploitation, not by inherent biological inferiority. This was a radical philosophical stand that served as a moral compass for a society drowning in the pseudoscientific racism of the time.
So it reverses the social Darwinist premise entirely. Social Darwinism looks at struggle and proclaims they are oppressed because they are weak and unfit.
And Du Bois looks at the same struggle and proclaims they are struggling because the system was constructed by powerful elites for deliberate exploitation.
And he rejected the idea that sociology should be this aloof, detached science.
He argued instead that the truths discovered through rigorous, objective research should serve as a liberating weapon to provide scientific guidance for redressing inequality. He devoted his life to showing, through systematic study, that exploitative hierarchies are built by human action and can only be torn asunder by human agency. His work is the definitive data-driven synthesis showing that social Darwinism is not only morally bankrupt, but factually wrong in its assessment of the causes of inequality.
We began this deep dive with the story of a corporate man who championed the law of the jungle until he became the victim of that law. He suddenly demanded fairness the moment he was purged. That instant shift illustrates that social Darwinism is fundamentally a defense mechanism for established power and inequality, a philosophy only useful when one is on the winning side, and immediately abandoned when the tables turn.
Social Darwinism is not an inevitable conclusion of science. It is, at its heart, a political choice. It's discredited as a theoretical framework because it relies on that fundamental category error. The jump from observation to ought, a moral prescription.
And it's discredited by history.
Completely. History shows its path from economic justification for tycoons to genocidal state policy targeting the unfit. But its survival in popular rhetoric, even today, proves its enduring utility as a tool for those seeking to rationalize their dominance and deflect attention from systemic inequalities.
So the moment we hear arguments about why we shouldn't intervene to help the struggling, or why massive inequality is simply natural, we have to recall Arthur the dock worker convinced his suffering was destiny, and Greta the school teacher forced to rationalize elimination.
We have to.
We must realize that the true measure of human progress is not found in accelerating the so-called natural order of the jungle, but in actively building systems rooted in empathy, mutual aid, and the recognition that inequality is a constructed choice.
The very act of building a society that ensures basic human rights, provides a safety net, and strives for equality is an intentional moral defiance of the jungle. It is an affirmation that we are not merely animals competing for scraps, but a species capable of cooperation and ethical choice, striving toward a constructed moral destiny, rather than submitting to a predetermined biological one.